And recording in process. Okay, let's go ahead and start. So thank you everybody for being here. Welcome to the new people. This is the FatBear Book Club, for lack of a better name. And we have been meeting since April of last year, I think, so about 9 months. We started by reading Mike Fitz's book, The Bears of Brooks Falls. Big thumbs up from everybody. We loved this book. And since the new year, we have been reading Sherry Simpson's wonderful Dominion of Bears. Also thumbs up. Today's event is not limited to Dominion of Bears. So if you haven't read this book, don't worry. You'll have plenty to talk about. I feel like today's event was maybe inspired by Dominion of Bears, but will probably be broader. And who are our special guests today? We have two very special people with us today. And they're going to talk about their experience with bears, their experience with Sherry's book, their experience with Brooks Camp and other parts of Alaska, and anything else you want to talk about. And I'll start by asking some just quick icebreaker questions, and then we'll open it up to the group. So welcome to our special guests. First, the lightning round questions. Can you tell us who you are, dear special guests?
We've been searching for years.
I can. Hi, everybody. I'm Susan Alexander.
And I'm Carl Ramm.
And why are you here? What is your connection to bears?
Because you asked us. I'm sorry, what is our connection to?
To bears. What
bears? Well, that's kind of a multifaceted question. My biggest connection to bears is that I'm the refuge manager for 2 refuges on the Alaska Peninsula, south of Katmai, for those familiar with Katmai, and Katmai National Park, I should say. And like Katmai, we have some of the highest concentrations of brown bears in the world on the refuges. Of course, having lived in Alaska for 30 plus years, I've had personal encounters with bears. We have bears in our backyard. So it's just kind of a bear intensive environment.
And I came to Alaska in 1983 in the military. I was an infantryman, and we were in the field a lot, and I pretty much had to start dealing with bears pretty quickly. I should say we never harmed a bear, and we never harmed bears in that, but we had to not just see them, but we had to kind of deal with them. And yeah, we're both kind of backcountry timber hippie nature nerds, and in Alaska you end up dealing with a lot of bears, and through a long chain of fortuitous events I ended up I guess I'm best known with bears in terms of being a bear tech, bear wrangler at Brooks Camp in Katmai National Park, where we're interacting with them all day long.
Carl, I believe that some of us may have seen you on the cams with sticks. Is that correct?
Yeah, my my alternate identity is Nunchuck Carl. Is what people call me. They're not really nunchucks, but strictly speaking. But yes, the stick guy. Other more pejorative terms that I won't mention too. But.
Now I have to ask you. The two of you are in a single location. Have you met before? Do you know each other?
Like know each other in the biblical sense, or
what is your relationship to each other?
Yes, we're married.
Okay.
We've been married for about 30 years.
All right. Susan, you mentioned the refuges. So I think most of us are, reasonably familiar with Brooks Camp, right? Because we've all seen the cams. But I imagine that a lot of people, including me, are not that familiar with the refuges. Can you give us kind of an introduction to the refuges?
Happily. Asking a refuge manager about the refuges is kind of like asking a parent about their kids. So I'll try not to go on too long. I manage Alaska Peninsula and Becharoff National Wildlife Refuges, which are, as I mentioned, on the Alaska Peninsula, south of Katmai. And for a little context, the National Wildlife Refuge system is not as well known as the Park Service. So a little bit of information, I think, about what system these lands are part of as the National Wildlife Refuge system is part of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it's a system of protected lands similar to the national parks, except that the focus is more on wildlife and wildlife habitat. Now, of course, the Park Service does a lot to preserve wildlife and wildlife habitat. Their focus is a little more on visitors, but we have visitors, but our focus is a little more on the wildlife. So there's a bit of a difference that way. We're both part of the Department of Interior. And there are lots of refuges out there, even though we're not as well known. There are 568 refuges in the United States, and there's at least one in every state. So wherever you're located, if you have not encountered a refuge near you yet, I encourage you to go to FWS.gov and find one. Most of them are open to the public. They're beautiful, they're rich in wildlife, and there are some really cool places out there. So I wanted to, let's see, the screen sharing thing worked when we tried it before you all got on. So I'm going to try to show you a map. And Stacy, if you could let me know if you can see that.
I can see it. There it is. We can see the whole map now.
Great, thank you. Okay, so people know where Katmai is. You know, we're all on the Alaska Peninsula. Of course, it's kind of the trunk of the elephant, extending out from Southwest Alaska between the Bering Sea and the Pacific Ocean. And so Katmai's right here. Brooks Camp. Can you see my cursor? Does that work for people, for me to point at things? I see nodding heads. Great. Okay, so Brooks Camp is right there. Here's King Salmon, which if some folks have visited Brooks Camp, you may or may not have come through King Salmon, but that's where we live. That's where the headquarters for Katmai National Park is. The headquarters for the refuges are in King Salmon. All the green stuff is what our office manages. And this part right up here is Becharoff National Wildlife Refuge. It has a big chunk of designated wilderness, as you can see, and Becharoff Lake, the second largest lake in Alaska. Then these two pieces are about 2/3 of Alaska Peninsula National Wildlife Refuge. It actually goes on down the peninsula further, but those parts are so far from King Salmon, and they're actually closer to an office we have in Cold Bay. So they're managed by them. We don't manage them, even though they're technically part of that refuge. And for those who are familiar with Aniakchak, which is another area managed by the Park Service by the same office that manages Katmai, that's right here. So the Park Service and the National Wildlife Refuges kind of hopscotch or leapfrog down the Alaska Peninsula going park, refuge, park, refuge. So that's the land that we manage. Oh yeah, sorry, 4 million acres, about the size of Connecticut. It's about 250 miles from King Salmon down to the southern tip of what our office manages, or about 2 hours flying in one of our small single engine aircraft, which is how we access the refuge to do more or less anything, because there are no roads.
So I have two questions that I'm sure other people have as well. One, is it possible that our bears, right, the bears that we see on the cams, is it possible that they would travel from Brooks Camp to the refuges? And also, can people come visit the refuges?
Excellent questions, thank you. And yes, the bears can, and I'm sure to some extent do. And Carl, correct me if I'm off on this. What I have understood, this is not as well understood as any of us would like, but 60 miles, I think I've heard as a reasonable number for how far a bear might travel. And of course, yeah, jump in.
I mean, they go to King Salmon.
Right, yes, that's true. Yes, we know they have come as far as King Salmon. So if you extend that down, you know, especially this more northerly part of the refuge, I'm sure they do come there some. And likewise, some of the bears that are primarily on the refuge, I'm sure, you know, like it's a cliche that they don't recognize boundaries. So they move around a lot. So yes, I'm sure they do. And yes, people do visit the refuges. And I don't know how much, Stacy, I know one of the questions you had mentioned was kind of the visitor experience on the refuges and who the visitors are. Do you want me to go into that now or hold that for later?
You can, that I think it'd be fine to talk about it. And Holly has posed a question in chat. She says, what are the differences around animal protection between the parks and the refuges, i.e. can you hunt on the refuges?
Yes, also a very good question. And yes, you can. And that is the biggest difference between, in terms of concrete on the ground management, especially in relation to bears, between Katmai National Park and the refuges. In the preserve portion of Katmai, there is hunting, but not in the park portion. But refuges, just in general, refuges are more oriented towards hunting in terms of our establishing legislation than parks are. Parks generally are closed. Refuges actually in what they call our organic legislation, which is the legislation that tells us, establish the mission statement and our priorities and for management, the whole kind of management framework, designated hunting as one of the top 6 priority public uses for refuges. And then on top of that, in Alaska, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, which created these refuges, stated they are open to hunting unless we go through basically what they call a rulemaking, creating new regulations to close them. So it's possible to close them to hunting, but it's a very involved process. So Congress twice said hunting is a priority. So yes, hunting is one of the 2 big uses on the refuge. As I'm sure you all will notice, these are more remote. We're further from king salmon, Homer, Anchorage. We're further down the peninsula. Our weather's a little worse. The further down the peninsula you go, the worse the weather gets. And so we're just more remote. We're harder to get to. You would not do a day trip from Homer to the refuge the way people do day trips from Homer to Brooks Camp. And so
do the 2 of you, how do visitation numbers compare? I mean, like, do you have a sense of how many visitors Brooks Camp gets per year?
Brooks gets about, I think it's around, I want to say it's around 12, 13,000.
Wow.
Season. And that's not counting the coast. I'm pretty sure that that's just Brooks Camp. I mean, it has to be 100 at least. I mean,
yeah,
it's a tiny, it's a very small fraction of Katmai. Katmai has vastly more visitation.
And part of that is because we don't have a Brooks Camp. We don't have one site that is just a world-class bear viewing area that draws that many visitors. Most of our visitors are guided and most of them are hunting or fishing. In the case of the hunting, they are primarily going out to, we have a competitive system for guided hunting in that big game guides who want to guide on the refuge, the green area you see is divided up into 21 guide use areas. And within those areas, guides compete to be either the only guide or one of 2 guides who can take clients out to hunt, either mostly for bear, some for moose. And I think that system is one of the strongest features of hunting on the refuge. The gray area that is this strip along the Bering Sea side of the peninsula is primarily state land. Around the communities, there is some Alaska Native Corporation lands, but on all the big chunks of state land along here, there is no competitive system. And very early on when I got here, a guide whom I considered to be one of the more aggressive and perhaps not that concerned with ethics guides described that area to me as a killing field. It's much more heavily used. They're much lower cost hunts. They're people who just want to get a bear. They don't really care whether it's what kind of bear it is. They don't, it's just more of a free for all. Right. So the competitive system on the refuge does 2 things. 1, it enables us to choose the best, most ethical guides. And 2, it gives us a pretty good handle, a means to control what they're doing because they have a special use permit, which has conditions attached to it. Their operating plan that they competed based on that operating plan is a condition of their permit, so they have to follow it. And the big hammer is if they don't, we can take their permit away and they no longer have exclusive use of that area, which of course enables them to have more expensive hunts. It's a whole different operation operating on the refuge where they have their own area as opposed to being in the fray out on the state land.
And this may be obvious, but I think I just wanted to just clarify a little why Susan went into all that detail, because I think the natural question is, it's called a refuge. Why is there so much hunting, right? What if it's a refuge? What's the difference? And that's part of it right there, is that while there is hunting, it is far more controlled than the kind of free fire zone that on the state lands. And I should say, I am sure that the Alaska Department of Fish and Game would love to get have more control on those lands. It's not that the Alaska Department of Fish and Game doesn't care what's going on out there. I don't want to drag everybody through it's a long legal and political discussion. I mean, I can talk about it if people want, but as to why it's the case. But the state doesn't like that it's that way, but it is that way. And that is one of the positive things about having the refuges there.
Sorry,
go ahead.
Oh,
I was just gonna say, I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat, and I think we'll go ahead and go with these questions, if that's all right. One question is about the economics of hunting. Sienna wonders, do the refuges or parks benefit in some way from the fees that are paid by the hunters? She says, since it can't be stopped, it would be nice to think that the money helps the other bears in some way. And Bob wonders, do the refuges have any say in hunting seasons, limits, etc.?
Those are great questions. And the economics, wow, we could probably talk this whole time just about the economics of hunting, especially guided hunting in Alaska on the peninsula. To answer the immediate question of whether or not the refuges, and I believe what I'm saying is generally true for the park as well, but I'm not as familiar with their arrangement. I know it's somewhat different from ours. For us, the guides do contribute some financially, but it's very, very small. A typical bear hunt on the peninsula costs $30,000 guided. And what the refuge gets from that is a $100 administrative fee for the permit and what we call client use days, which is a fee per client per day. That I haven't checked, they update it every year, but I think it's about $7 a day. So it's minute. And that's unfortunately set in regulation, how those fees are determined. And as I mentioned earlier, regulations can be changed, but it's a long and complicated political process. So to answer, gosh, I'm sorry, all of a sudden I blanked on what the second question was. Can you remind me, Stacy?
Do the refuges have any say in the limits, or it sounds like no, correct?
The limits, like seasons, bag limits, means and methods of take for all hunts are set by the state for the most part. So we have some influence in a couple of different ways. One is that we have, especially here and in most areas of the state at a local level, we have a good relationship with the Department of Fish and Game, the state Fish and Game. And we communicate with them, we assist with surveys, we talk a lot. So we do have, and we can officially comment when they're considering regulation changes. So that's one way. The other way is that sometimes, and this is fairly rare, but it does happen, if our legal in some ways, our legal mandates are different from the state legal mandates. And in those cases, we can create our own regulations that apply only on the federal lands. And that tends to be politically fraught. The state doesn't like it, but we have done it in some instances. The Kenai National Wildlife Refuge some years ago, I can't remember the exact regulation, but it was a limit in relation to bear hunting. It might have had to do with bear baiting.
I'm sure that's
I'm not,
I think it was
that
beyond,
was part of it.
Baiting,
it was more than bear baiting, but that was part of it. And basically limited those practices on the refuge more than they would be limited by the state. And that has been a huge political hot potato ever since. So those are the two ways that can potentially happen where we have some influence.
So we have jumped very quickly into questions. I wonder if it would be, Susan, if you're done with your map for now, maybe we could stop screen sharing and that would give us a bigger, There is a question about, okay, so now we can see the group, and if you actually want to ask a question out loud, you can, y'all can keep asking questions in chat, which is totally fine. But if you want to raise your hand and ask a question out loud, that's easy to do now too. There is a question, and I guess we'll stick with the hunting topic now, although we don't have to talk about hunting the whole time, everybody. But there is another question. Do you all have a sense? There's a question about the numbers of bears and moose that are hunted. Do you all have a sense of those numbers, either for the refuges or more broadly for the state of Alaska?
Whew.
Off the top of your head.
I don't know if you know, love, for the state as a whole, I was thumbing through Simpson's book this morning and she talks about it. I know, but I don't remember the numbers.
It varies so much though.
Yeah.
You know, it's not it varies a lot, of course, with populations. We have also I'm sure that the take on bears has been down for at least since they changed there were some changes to the season. The local, the local Alaska Department of Fish and Game biologists got the Board of Game, so most of these regulations are determined kind of at a state level, got them to decrease the number of weeks, right?
They went
per
from
season.
3 weeks to 2
2
weeks.
weeks, because there was
It's more or less an annual season. It alternates between spring and fall.
right.
But, yeah.
So because there was the feeling that there was too much take going on, and it was quite a bit less. My understanding with moose is that, you know, the Alaska Peninsula is not a big place for moose. It's very strange for us, having come from South Central Alaska, where you see the brush is very heavily browsed in most places from moose, and you don't see that here. The willows, and moose really hammer willows in South Central Alaska. You don't see that out here much at all. There's huge willows. And that's a long kind of discussion in itself as why that's the case. They haven't been on the peninsula that long, as far as anyone can tell. But there's not a big population. What moose are out here are pretty big, so there is a little bit of interest in it. But I would guess anyway that most moose here are taken by locals as opposed to.
I think it's maybe about half and half.
Is it?
Okay. It depends on the year, in that, you know, I mentioned that the bear hunt alternates spring and fall, and the moose hunt is in the fall. So in the years when there is a fall bear hunt, the guides are coming out here anyway for the bears, so they will bring moose clients as well. In the years when there is no bear hunt, for a lot of them, it's not worth it to them to mobilize their entire operation, get their base camps up and running and all of that just for the moose hunt, because as Carl mentioned, this is not a big moose area. And actually, if you don't mind, Stacy, while I've got the floor, I've been reading the chat now that I don't have my map blocking the view, and the subject is trending in a direction that is a big deal for me professionally and personally, and that is the conflict between bear viewing and bear hunting. And it is a real and true conflict, and I will tell you all that my personal preferences are very much on the side of viewing bears. I love going to Brooks Camp, knowing the bears, understanding their lives. But I work for a refuge that is a huge bear hunting refuge. It is scary to think that one of the bears that we all watch on the cams or see in the river could wander over the line, either into the preserve or into the refuge, and be taken by a hunter. And there's also, I don't think you all are there yet, but in Simpson's book, there is a great description of a huge controversy that happened some years back, opening up an area of the preserve near McNeil River Sanctuary, where the bears are viewed. And this is also, I think, going to be an emerging issue on the refuge, because we're starting to get more interest in bear viewing. And we've gone through the legal hoopla to be able to give permits for bear viewing. And we've had some interest, but right now, all the bears that are being viewed are also hunted because of that, that system I told you about with all the guide use areas. That's every inch of the refuge. Every square inch of this refuge is part of somebody's guide use area. So I see this as a huge problem coming towards these refuges in the future, both from the standpoint of people who watch bears and get to know them. It's a horrible thought that those bears might then be hunted. And there is a very real concern in terms of the take of the bears, that if they're habituated to people, they may be easier to take, that they won't move away from a hunting party. So I won't delve too much more into it than that, other than to say that, yes, it's a huge concern, personally, professionally. I think it's going to be more of an issue in the future for the lands that I'm responsible for than it is now.
Thank you for recognizing that. And just a reminder to everybody that this is being recorded. And I think you've hit on like one of the really complicated issues at the heart of Simpson's book. Carl, did I see a finger raised?
Yeah, just a quick thing. I'm impressed by how much Sherry's book still holds up. But I think one thing that has changed a little bit, and again, this is another one of these things that we could go on for a very long time about, but there is some thought now, and I've certainly seen evidence of it, having been on Katmai and on the refuges, that what used to be thought of, and I think still to a fair extent is thought of as habituation by other humans, or bears becoming habituated to the presence of humans, is to some extent, and I do say to some extent, I don't think it's exclusively that way, but is to some extent a byproduct of them getting used to each other. Because they're in this, to some extent, I doubt that there's like a get used to humans gene, right? Versus the get used to other bears gene. To some extent, it's kind of getting used to these things that you really just don't like being around. And it spills over because, of course, the bears it's not normal for them to be in these. They don't really like it. I'm sure the CAM viewers here, people who've been to Brooks a number of times, have noticed that in June, when everybody shows up at the falls, they're all kind of like this every year when they get back. But a lot of the thinking now is that that some of the habituation that you see is a byproduct of that. And having been out in the refuges, I've had bears walk right by me, just like it was Katmai. Well, Susan and I had a long experience. We had one bear that was a little too dark. It was hard times bear.
Yes.
Hard times bear. That's another story. But we had hard times bear. It was way too comfortable with us. And these bears are not. I mean, there's no bear viewing at the location where we were, but there are a lot of bears there, and so to some extent, and I don't think anyone knows exactly what the extent is, that habituation is just to them to other bears. In fact, it's not. I don't necessarily advise watching it, but I have seen some bow hunting footage from probably the 1910s or the 1920s, maybe, of bow hunters who came up here, and they're just kind of walking up to a bear, right? And before bear viewing or anything like that. It's, the bear is just kind of standing there looking at the guy. So it's not as new a thing, I think, as sometimes, and is not as driven by bear viewing as people sometimes think it is. I think it's still a serious issue, and I'm not trying to make light of it. I just want a little context for that.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm glad you made that point, Carl. Sherry Simpson does talk about that in her book, and that's something that surprised me, right? That she does say that maybe the bears that are comfortable around other bears, right? The bears that can fish with other bears are comfortable around people too.
Good. I'd forgotten that. I didn't.
I think it was in the chapter that we just read, so you're bringing it up is relevant. Bob has a good question in chat, but I want to go first to Sienna so we can hear your voice, and you'll need to unmute.
Sorry. Thank you both so much for your time. I'm originally from Australia, so this is so fascinating for me. And I hope that we get to see you again before we finish the book. But I'm just wondering, because I've only been watching the cams for a year, but I know that some of the people on here are longtime viewers, and they will mention a bear that was very healthy, not that old, who just disappeared. And I'm wondering, with the hunts, are you given descriptive information on the bears that are killed? So that because you're both so experienced and you know Brooks, you would actually know if one of those bears was gone.
Right.
Unfortunately, no. Unless the only way someone could make that connection is that the hunters are required to bring the bear's hide into the Department of Fish and Game to be measured and sealed. They put a little tag, locking tag on it. And it's possible that if the person doing the sealing was very familiar with the bear, that maybe they could make that connection. But for us in my office, even though those bears were taken on the refuge, they're taken under state hunting regulations. And so we never see those bears. And this is not completely true, but I guess I would say there's very little crossover in my experience between the people who are involved in, especially the guided big game hunting, and the folks who are involved in the bear viewing world. I know of a few little instances of crossover, but not many.
There are rumors around king salmon. I'm not going to name bear names, and this is pre bear cam bears, but there are rumors about that are kind of persistent about one or two well-known ones. But
yeah,
it makes me think of something that the rangers tell us all the time on the cams, which is that one of the hard things about watching the cams is that we often don't know the end of a bear's story, right? I would say more times than not, bears just disappear. And I think that's really hard for us because we like to be able to know, to put a period at the end of that sentence, but more times than not, we don't.
It's worth remembering too that, kind of reminded about this right now that we're in spring thaw. Den collapse is a again, very, very little in detail is known about the mortality of these bears, but den collapse is a serious issue, and that of course can happen to a healthy bear. In den collapse, if people don't know, if it's a wet winter, like we've had not the last couple, but quite a few winters, or especially in the spring, if the timing's wrong and the bear, maybe got a relatively low altitude denning site, the soil gets moist and they'll collapse. And so, things like that are a possibility. I think that would probably for adult bears be one of the main things, but they also get in fights. But yeah, there's just so very, very little known about those individual bears once they're no longer in the camera.
I remember asking Mike Fitz in 2019. I was volunteering at Brooks, and I asked Mike, where's bead nose? Why haven't we seen bead nose? And he said he listed the many things that could have happened, and because she was very healthy when we last saw her in 2018. And he said, well, it could be den collapse. She could have injured herself. She could have had cancer. And I thought, what? Bears get cancer? But apparently they do. And so it's hard not to know.
Yeah, I thought she was a little slow. And so this is one of these bear management things, right? It's one of the things that you learn interacting with bears is kind of how they are on their game on a particular day. And she was as savvy as ever, but I felt like she was just a tad slower. It doesn't say much, but there are also subtleties that might not show up in the kind of the low resolution world of watching them, but when you're 5 yards from them a lot, you kind of pick up on a little more.
You do get closer than most of us. I want to go to Bob's question in chat, which is again about following the money. Bob says, I assume the economics, the financial, this is he's asking again about the difference between bear viewing and bear hunting. And he says, I assume the economics and the financial benefit to the state, it's heavily skewed towards bear viewing rather than hunting. Is that correct? Do you know how how the economics of viewing versus hunting breaks out?
Sort of. Well, I'll take a shot at it and then I think you should jump in. I don't really know. I don't know the numbers. And certainly bear viewing involves much larger numbers of people. So I think that probably the economics in terms of driving the state's economic engine, that's a correct statement. And I know this is not exactly what Bob asked about, but kind of very closely tied with that is the political influence that those two industries have. And I would say that Alaska is still old school Alaska enough that I would say hunting still has, I mean, they both have a lot of political clout. But I would say hunting maybe still has more, especially the guide organization, the Alaska Professional Hunters Association, has a tremendous amount of political influence in the state.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't add too much to that, except to say that even with bear viewing, even though that's, I have my feelings about hunting are complicated, but I certainly have no interest in bear hunting personally, but even the economic clout of bear viewing isn't always a good thing for bears. It is in some ways, but I think, even though in a lot of ways I'm kind of forced to be a pragmatist about wildlife, even though I'd rather just always be an idealist. The kind of that which lives by economic utility dies by economic utility. And economic utility, for example, I'm just going to put this a little bit in the hypothetical right now, but if we think that Brooks Camp should be moved across the river to areas where bears are not, don't move as much as they do, which I personally, I would like to see that, even though it make bear management unbearably boring. It's still the right thing in my book. But one of the reasons, it's a complicated situation, but certainly one of the reasons why that has not happened is the economic pressures from the world of bear viewing. And of course, the Katmai Coast, which is crazy with bear viewing also right now. A lot of why it's crazy is that same economic pressure. This is not, I don't say this I just say that just to kind of, clarify. We tend to, especially those of us who are bear viewers, kind of would view, the economic might of bear viewing as a good thing, but it isn't always. It's complicated.
That's very provocative, and I expect that we may come back to that. But I see that Holly has her hand raised.
So slightly different topic, but again, I think you spend lots of time at Brooks Camp, both of you. I was wondering if you had any favorite bears or memorable ones.
That's a great question.
Okay. I'm a Holly cultist through and through, right? She charged me last year, so.
Holly charged you?
Holly, it was a half-baked charge. Well, charge is one of these words. Maybe we'll get into it, but I think, Stacy, I think you've seen the typology I made for bear aggression. Everybody uses the word charge when there are all kinds of ways, that bears, having had bears be aggressive with me at close range over 40 times, you kind of experience, and camp viewers, I'm sure, have seen that too. There are a lot of ways that bears can be aggressive with each other. But yeah, she did. But no, I could go on all day about Holly. I'm a huge Holly fan.
Yeah,
she's the best.
Is she your favorite bear, Carl?
Oh yeah. She's not. I think you may, and Stacy, maybe some others have heard me say this before. I mean, she might not be as smart as 284, and there might, like, on individual characteristics, there might be a better bear on the river. But to me, having interacted with her a lot, I think she's the best rounded bear.
Sorry, that can be taken more than one way.
Yeah, well, okay, yeah, not a fat bear. I'm not getting into the fat bear thing, but she's just a really well balanced bear. Yeah. She's not too aggressive, but she's not too timid. All those things. Yeah.
So yeah, well, I guess in a way it's kind of boring. It's like, yeah, we're both Holly fans. Although I can think I love what a great mom she is. And my favorite bear video moment ever is the one that I think won her the FatBear title, with her sitting on the beach with her legs out, scratching her belly. I just watched that over and over. Yeah,
She's relatable.
she's very relatable. Yes. So great question.
Carl, you mentioned, I think you mentioned just now 40 close encounters with bears.
Oh,
Is
hundreds
that-
of close encounters.
I'm curious how many times, Carl, you've probably used your bear spray. Well, I'm going to back up one step. You might give people a sense of how being a bear management ranger is different than being like a ranger who stands on the platform and answers questions.
Right.
What do you do?
Mhm.
How do you do it? And
Right.
how often have you had to use bear spray? Because I imagine that bear management people use bear spray way more than
Oh, yeah.
anybody else.
Yeah, I'm surprised. Actually, I'm very surprised that bear researchers haven't come out and dealt with bear management at Brooks Camp, because there's really not anything else like it in terms of what we end up doing. So bear management is a kind of different part of a different division in Katmai National Park. We're under the conservation heading, as opposed to the rangers that most people meet, who are interpretive rangers with interp. And so there was what we could loosely call the bear team, which Leslie Scora is our queen, our brunette Galadriel, and the bear team is divided up into, well, I guess Tammy is kind of a team of her own, and that Tammy Carmack is the person who does as a lot of you know, who has the cool job of numbering the bears and doing the official monitoring of behaviors and such. And then there's kind of what you could call the bear chasers, or the bear management team proper, who's in camp. And Michael Saxton is first among equals. He's our lead. He's not, I don't know that he has an official leadership title, but he is certainly our leader. We certainly view him that way. And our job in camp, and when we fulfill a lot of functions, but the one that people see and think about, and the one that we spend the most time doing, is being bear bouncers, keeping bears out of camp if we can, but there aren't very many of us. I think there's usually 4 of us, and there's usually only 1 or 2 on duty at a time. And camp is pretty big, as a lot of you know. So bears get into the camp, and if a lot, and if they do get into camp, then we get them out. Unlike most other places, we do not use, well, we almost,
Talk about why camp,
oh,
why you keep them out of
why
camp.
we keep them out of camp. Yeah.
And
Maybe
what
that's
is
up to
camp? What is camp?
Oh, I'm
Where
sorry.
are
Brooks
bears
Camp.
allowed and
Sorry,
where are
Brooks Camp.
bears forbidden?
Brooks Camp downriver from Brooks Falls.
And like
So near the lodge, really.
area,
Right,
like
the lodge
yeah.
area. There's some Park Service housing in there. Yeah, the visitor center, that area. About from the river to roughly halfway to the campground is kind of, which is, so from the river, I don't know, 250 yards north of the river where the river meets the lake.
And why don't we want bears there? Why is that a bad thing?
Yes, very good question. And because people have suicidal tendencies is my short answer. Because a not large minority, but a minority that has effect way beyond its numbers of people simply do not care about rules at Brooks Camp and are way too cool for school. And beyond that, there's also a well-meaning part of the population whose neocortex shut down in the presence of cubs. I mean, just out, right? And they just want to pick up, man, I just want to hold your cub for a second, walk off with it, right? I mean, you think I'm exaggerating, but we had somebody pet a cub on the beach in 2019. And I'm sure there's a lot that we don't see, no doubt about it. And so the bears want to be in camp. And Sherry Simpson talks about this to some extent in the book, but it's not because the camp is in a terrible place in terms of bear movement along the river, because especially the sows with cubs and the subadults want to cut across because they like to go north of the campground, which is north of camp. Holly especially is this way. She raises all her cubs in July anyway, north of camp. She has her little regular commute. If you've seen the video that the guy took where Holly and her cubs are supposedly following her through the, she's on her regular commute route. That trail she was on, she was just doing her daily walk back to the river, back, the river back. So the bears both want to cut through to go up there, which there were no bears on the river when the camp was started. So nobody knew about that kind of thing, but they want to go through so they can get away from the male bears and rest. And nowadays they also want to be in camp, both because one, we have cut grass in camp, which they much prefer cut grass to uncut grass. And you might say, well, why not just not cut the grass? But then you have bears disappearing in the grass all the time. And I can tell you from experience, I've literally had to get up to, I shouldn't admit this because I'm not supposed to do this, but there are times when I've had to get within 3 feet of a bear. Yeah, I know. What do I have to lose? I've had to get within 3 feet of a bear to find it in the grass. So they disappear. So that's not good. And also the bears know, the male bears will come into camp every now and then, especially early in the year if they're following the female. But for the most part, big males do not like being in camp. The other bears know this. And one of the things that helps preserve my conscience as a bear tech is it is abundantly clear to me from observing this over the years that you could be the biggest, baddest bear tech to ever walk Brooks Camp, and you are nothing to a bear compared to other bears. They are far more worried about each other than they're worried about bear techs. The easiest proof of that being they come into camp. Holly comes into camp. She's been hazed for 20 years now. She still comes into camp like this, right? And so, it can't be that stressful. She keeps coming back. So, so bears want to be there. People are there. People have suicidal tendencies. Also, we have the 50-yard rule, which a lot of you know about, where you're not supposed to approach a bear within 50 yards. Bear management is kind of exempt from that, but for other rangers and the general public, it's a pretty hard and fast rule, and I think for good reasons. But when that's the case, if bears had their way in Brooks Camp, there'd be at least one bear every 50 yards and camp would not move, right? And so it just wouldn't even be functional. So
you can't see.
And you can't see. There's all kinds of blind spots. That's another kind of whole other crazy thing about Brooks Camp that's unique. Is all the buildings with blind spots and bears and stuff. So for all those reasons, it's the only reason I can do this job in good conscience, even though I admit to liking to interact with bears. I do have a conscience, and the only reason I can do this job is because they just really shouldn't be in camp. And I do love the idea of moving camp elsewhere, but ultimately you have to play the card you're dealt, and the card we are dealt with is, for the foreseeable future, Brooks Camp where it is.
For people who don't know, there was a proposal, and this is going to be the very superficial and not completely accurate, but there was a proposal to build the permanent bridge and essentially move the lodge from that side of the river to this side of the river, so that basically all of the human activity would be concentrated on one side of the river, right? So that the bears could kind of have that side and people would have this side. And a decision was made to build the bridge, but not move the lodge. So that's when you say, deal the card we're dealt. And I will say that my impression, Carl, is bear management rangers care about the bears deeply, and you all are not running around bumping bears, moving bears willy-nilly. If a bear is sleeping, people try to let the bear sleep. If a bear is sleeping on the beach, you know, we try to keep people away from the sleeping bear. But I feel like what bear management is trying to do is minimize the risk of problematic human bear encounters.
That's the ultimate aim. And yeah, and then just a quick thought, just to say, like bear aggression. So a lot of my days at Brooks Camp are one big brown blur by the end of it. I mean, on my deathbed, I'll see big bear butts running down a trail like this in front of me, I'm sure. It's a very surreal thing, like you're on some kind of bizarre sled dog thing when you're chasing them out of camp. But so we can interrupt as one bear tech. If it's a year when there are a lot of bears down river, I could probably have 3 dozen events where I have to get bears out of camp. And in a day, you know, pretty easily. And sometimes there are 5 bears running around camp all at once. I mean, it's great. The weirder it gets, the better. But and coastal brown bears are amazingly docile. I mean, I would never want to do with human beings what we have to do in bear. I wouldn't want to do with chimpanzees what we have to do with bears, or cattle, you know, bulls anyway. And so, but when you start doing it enough, so I mean, I don't know how many times I've had to get bears, hundreds and hundreds of times I've had to get bears to do things that bears don't want to do. Out of those, and I don't know really how many times I've had bears do something kind of the bear equivalent of giving me the middle finger in a pointed way. I don't know how many times I've had that happen. When, say, something within 10 yards, when they're definitely aggressive, yeah, somewhere over 40, I'm not sure. I've used, in my life, I've used bear spray 8 times. And every bear I've ever sprayed never took another step toward me. And I've had some pretty angry bears come at me. So I'm certainly a believer in bear spray. So yeah, that's the rough outline of it.
That's helpful. Thank you. I see a couple of really good questions in chat that I want to come back to, but Kasha, your hand is raised. So go for it.
Okay, now maybe to kind of sum up, though we're not finished, I hope, but I finally had time to browse through the book instead of just cramming up. And I started reading the chapter about Brooks Camp, the watched bear. And I found this fantastic sentence where she says, each of us had paid more than $500 for the privilege of watching bears at close range, forgetting that here the bears can watch us right back for free.
That's great.
That's excellent. Susan,
do.
Carl, do you want to respond to that?
And they do. They pay a lot more attention than we think they do. And that's something that has become more and more clear. I know, Stacy, you had, you know, when a question I know that you were thinking about asking was, what if I could get a general message to the public, what it would be. And it's kind of along the lines of that statement about bears watching people in a way. And that is, I'm not a big believer in the idea of bluff charges for reasons I can go into. And actually, Sherry covers that briefly in her book too, as well. It's another thing that I like about it. But bears do bluff. Bears are, they bluff a lot. When it comes to charging, it's kind of a different deal. And I wish people would get that, because I think that people, this is a very generalized thing, but I think that you hear from people, bears, they just do stuff out of the blue, you know? I mean, the bear was just sitting there eating and minding its own business, and I was just gonna walk over here. Next thing, it charges me, like right out of the blue, right? And it's understandable, because that's how the situation appears to them from their perspective. I don't want to be too harsh on people, but the reality is, one is bears are individuals, of course, and two is that bears do not like showing fear. They will do it, but by the time a bear is sufficiently freaked out that it's showing fear, you're probably in a pretty bad situation. In general, bears will they'll hide it as best they can. And people expect a lot more emotion from bears because they don't want you thinking that they're afraid. And so, and I'm not recommending that people do this. The whole issue of looking bears in the eyes when they're near, that's a complicated thing. But when I'm up close to bears, I am looking them right in the eye, because as with people, it's kind of hard to lie with your eyes. And I think it's hard for bears to lie with their eyes, because I want to figure out what state that bear is in. And a lot of you may have seen that video of 747 walking past a group of people near the trailhead to the Falls Trail, and sees the sign bear on there and turns around. Big bad 747 doesn't like the sign bear and comes around. 747 is super stressed in that video.
Yeah.
And I don't think those people by 747 had any idea of that. It was to my mind, at least, super obvious when he came back the other way that he did not like going by them in the first place, but he wasn't jaw popping and he wasn't making a lot of noise. And so, yeah, bears, they will show emotion, but it generally takes a lot. And a lot of bad behavior at Brooks, and I think elsewhere, takes place because people think that they can tell easily when a bear's stressed, and that's not true. And so, yes, but the whole thing is, though, they are aware of you. They may be acting like they're eating grass. They may be eating at the falls. Some of you may have noticed that the big males, when they go to the island, sorry, this is for bear camp people, when they come back toward the island from the jacuzzi, they almost always face away from the cams. You know, there are a lot of things that if you watch long enough, you can see they are hyper aware of us, even if they act like they are much too cool to care about us.
Susan, do people visiting the refuges get up close? I two questions. One, do people visiting the refuges have those kind of close encounters with bears the way that people do at Brooks Camp? And perhaps relatedly, what's the one thing you wish people knew about bears? What's the one thing you wish people knew about bears?
Well, first question is, yes, you certainly potentially can. It depends, there is nowhere that is a kind of organized, structured viewing area the way Brooks Camp is. Or even the Katmai Coast. I mean, some of you might be familiar with the bear viewing operations out there, where people fly into a certain area and there are, it's not structured in the sense of constructed buildings and the lodge and the cabins and all that, but still there are areas that people where they tend to sit and where they tend to watch, and it's all fairly choreographed, I guess. There's nothing like that on the refuges. The little bit of bear viewing that we have now tends to be people flying out for the day there are a number of lodges around King Salmon, and they're primarily fishing. They'll either fish here locally or they'll fly people out onto the refuge or the park for the day, and they'll fish and then they'll come back and have a nice dinner at the lodge. They're doing some bear viewing like that as well from those same lodges, where they'll fly out for the day and watch bears. That said, it's like they're out there on the landscape, the bears are out there on the landscape. There's no one there watching them. We don't have rangers the way there are at Brooks, partly because we wouldn't know where to put them, and partly because we have a much smaller staff. But also, it's much more kind of free and open, and it all depends on where the bears are, who's guiding the group, how much they know about the local patterns of movement of the bears, and just chance and happenstance. They are cutting through the brush and they may have a really close encounter if they're not making noise and trying to be bear smart. Or they may see one way over there and that's the only thing they see. It's much more open-ended and random, I guess. And the thing that I wish more people understood about bears is, I don't think not nearly as novel or insightful as Carl's. I kind of echo what's really the big theme, I think, of Simpson's book, is that we all have so many ideas about what bears are, and there's an unfortunate tendency to stereotype them in a number of different ways. Either they're the ferocious monsters or they're a teddy bear, And really they're neither, but the reality is so much more complex and interesting. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I think that's, and I guess that if the only PS I'd add on that, that is mostly specific to Alaskans, is that I wish they got it, that bear spray is documented by research, more effective than guns, and get over the, oh, some little spray is not going to keep that monster away, I need my gun. It's proven that, you know, there's a lot of research to back it up now. And so that's a little PS.
We just read the chapter where we just read a chapter where she talks a lot about bear spray and how effective it is. It wasn't until I read the chapter this time that I realized one of the things that she points out is that bear spray was invented by a woman, a graduate student, so a young woman who invented bear spray. And we were talking about, you know, the names that we associate with bears, like, you know, Timothy Treadwell. But I want to always remember that bear spray was invented by a female graduate student. That makes me very happy.
Thank you. That's great.
That's great.
I had forgotten that. I'm sure I read it, but it's been a lot of years since I read the book. So.
I didn't notice. Sorry, go ahead, Carl.
It is I am a huge believer in bear spray. Huge. I'm a kind of an obsessive advocate, as Susan will, for bear spray. There are contexts when it's pretty weak. They're kind of limited. It's not great in super high winds, which in most places aren't an issue, but can be an issue out here. Yeah, it's still underrated. People have an attachment.
Vastly.
I would not say that there's never a place. I haven't carried other than when I do some bear guarding work for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where I have to carry bear spray. I haven't carried a gun for years. I wouldn't necessarily say that I would never do it in a high wind area. An unfortunate reality in this state, and I mention it because I think it's an important thing to understand certain subtleties about how things are handled in the state. But when it comes to defense, self-defense with bears, is that, and Sherry Simpson also mentions this in the book, to her great credit. She's one of the few people I've ever seen mention it. So every time a bear kills somebody in the state, or there's a serious mauling, you know, unless it was somebody doing cartwheels on top of it, well, even Timothy Treadwell, it's true. Yeah, there's a shooting spree, and 4 or 5 bears get killed. And you know, when I thought I've thought obsessively about these issues, as Susan I think will also testify, and I'm carrying a gun, and I can't rule it out completely because, frankly, I came to the conclusion that it was better that for bears as a whole, if you can save your life and one bear dies, it's better than getting mauled or getting killed and having 5 bears die. It shouldn't be that way. Now that's my calculation. Other people may find it different. I wish the world wasn't that way, but that's what we have. Right.
There's a couple of questions in the chat for you, Carl, that I will kind of marry together. One person wants to know, they might be different. One person wants to know, have you ever had a close encounter with a dominant male bear, like 747 or 856?
Like an aggressive.
And another question is, what's the bear? Is there one bear that when you hear on the radio, you know, that this particular bear is coming to camp, that you just dread it? Who do you dread coming to camp?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And you, one of your questions that you thought you might ask, you kind of, maybe because you've heard me go on and on about it, Stacy, you kind of presaged that when you mentioned Holly and Grazer. But anyway, go back to the first part. You know, I've had lots of encounters, of course, with big males, like people do when they walk the Falls Trail and such. In general, when big males come into camp, we let them go through. I think It may be generally thought it's because, you know, they're big and aggressive and it's a bigger deal. And maybe that was the thinking behind it. But I think for me, the main thing is they're just not going to stay in camp. Big males don't, they're coming, they've got some business, you know, maybe early in the season when the place doesn't reek of people or something like that time, the video that somebody got of Chunk tearing apart the side of a cabin, you know, or something like that. But that's early in the season. Later in the season, when there are people around, they're going A to B, generally speaking. And so that's why I don't. So I've hazed 2 bears, 2 big male bears. And that was pretty unusual. Both of them, oddly enough, were slept right down below the superintendent's cabin in the same year. And one of them was 32 Chunk, and the other one was some big blonde male that I'd never seen before, and wasn't Otis. And I don't know who he was. They were both pushovers. Easy schmeezy. They were nothing. They were just like, oh man, come on. Jeez, guy, I'm just sleeping, you know? And they kind of got up, you know, and walked off, but they were easy peasy. So the ones I fear are sows. Okay. Fear might not be the right word, but the ones that make like, okay, this is going to be interesting. And I would say 2 of them. One was the one that you had kind of mentioned in some of our email exchanges, and one of them is Grazer. Not because and I think those of you who know Grazer have some idea why I say that, but Grazer is actually ridiculously easy to haze. Okay, Grazer is in that sense easier than those big males were, because they at least kind of drug their heels. Grazer's hyper reactive, and she doesn't like coming into camp, you know, and it's not an accident that those 2 traits are together, I'm sure. And she's hyper reactive, so she's really easy to move. But the whole time I'm thinking, if I get one, you know, if this is just a little bit off, she's going to charge. And I really hate that if she has like spring cubs. I usually let sows with spring cubs through, and I get behind them and kind of push them out. Not so much. I mean, unfortunately, I'm kind of what's the right word when you I'm desensitized to being charged. I mean, if I get charged before 7 at night, I don't lose any sleep. It's not good. It helps me sleep, but it's not really a good thing. But I don't like it because I worry about either the little cubs being sprayed, or mom kind of panics and one of the little cubs gets stepped on, you know, and all that really bothers me, of course, like with all the other bear techs. So we just generally let them go through. So Grazer, also, I would say though, who's more of a practical problem is 284. And she is known on the bear team as the Queen of Mean. And lovingly known as mostly lovingly known as the Queen of Mean. But she's a charger. She's really smart. She's a good mom. She really takes care of her cubs, and her cubs are just like her. I basically stuck my bear. I didn't set off the bear spray can, but I basically stuck my bear spray up one of her cubs' nostrils one time, just to keep it from coming at me. I sprayed her last year. She came at me behind the lodge, and she does that a lot. And so far, she's never connected. I don't know if she would or not. I don't believe in bluff charges, but I don't know that she's really angry enough to. I think she'd have to be pretty mad. But yeah, Grazer and 284 definitely.
Very interesting. Thank you. I see a couple more questions in chat, but let's go now to Elizabeth, who has her hand raised, and you'll need to unmute.
Hi, everybody. This is a great conversation. Thank you. I was interested about bear spray. One of the things that Sherry talked about is that, people take their bear spray, but then they don't really know how to use it. Or in the moment when they're encountering a bear, in that split second when you have to decide what to do, they've either forgotten it, it's in a knapsack that's stuck, or they don't. And at the same time, the bear is charging at 88 feet per second or something outrageous like that.
Mhm.
So what I was wondering is, okay, so you get the bear can, the bear spray. How do you get trained enough so that you can automatically take the can out and handle it the right way? So what kinds of things do you suggest so that people become acclimated and it becomes automatic?
Oh, gosh.
Great question.
Okay, so you said,
Yeah, how long do we have?
Stacy, you said we have 4 hours, is that right? Okay, so Susan will, I think, also will testify that she sees me in the garage and a fair amount doing my draw practice with my bear spray. I've started teaching bear spray for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I help with some with the bear training that the park does. And okay, so a whole bunch of things all at once. I have to get myself in linear order here. One thing I will say is that, okay, so just for a little context, you always see, and I've certainly seen a lot, the bears can go 35 miles per hour. And I think that's true. I have one time seen a bear that I think was going 35 miles per hour. It was a subadult that was sleeping on the beach down kind of by the lodge, and one of these big otters, which are these huge planes, the guy didn't see I'm going to be charitable and say he didn't see the bear sleeping on the beach, came and parked the otter right on top of this subadult. The subadult blasted through camp just at an unbelievable rate of speed, came within about 2 feet of a couple in their late 70s and blasted out. And I think that bear was actually going 35 miles per hour. I've never been charged by a bear that I felt like was going close to that speed. The problem is that I've never been charged from a bear that initiated a charge more than 20 yards away. Okay, I think all my charges have been well within 20 yards. So bears can go fast, but they're large. So they have a lot of inertia to overcome. It's like a big semi, right? A semi can go, I'm not a trucker, but I assume semis can go at least fairly fast once they have a chance to get going, but you're never going to run a drag race with a semi. And a big bear has to overcome a lot of inertia to come at you. So they don't generally come at you full speed, or if they do, they've had a lot of time to practice, and hopefully you're aware enough to pick it up. So that's one aspect of it. I did, however, have.
Can I add one thing?
Oh,
there,
yeah,
though?
absolutely.
Though it is still a matter of seconds.
Oh, yeah.
It's still pretty darn quick.
It is.
I've only been charged once, but when we were out backpacking, and the first time Carl ever used his pepper spray, and I don't think I had said it to him, but he carried it up here on his backpack, and he would, as we were walking along, just sort of take it in and out, flip the safety back off, put it back in. And I was thinking, oh my goodness, he's being so compulsive about this, and then we got charged. And the only thought in my mind is I'm seeing the bear coming and he's right here, is can he possibly get his pepper spray out in time? And he did. And I never questioned him again. So, we figured like what, 3 seconds, we think you had maybe?
Yeah, 3 seconds.
So anyway, sorry.
No, that was good. That was a good point. So no, I'm a believer in practicing, but I don't think it's necessarily as bad as people think it is. You have a lot of leeway with bear spray, so you don't have to be super exact. But sorry, I need to get my thoughts in kind of linear form again. The one time I have been charged by one of actually Beadnose's cubs, charged me from really close. And I won't go into the whole description of how that came about, but it's also a lesson. I'm going to put another rule in there because I think it goes in with this, and I kind of want to emphasize it. I make trail and get out of the way, on the Falls Trail or whatever. I get out of the way real quickly and I go away as far into the woods as I safely can. And I'm a huge believer in that. And, but once I have established, that a bear and I are squared off, right? If you guys know what I mean by like, okay, this is kind of mano a mano now, to use a kind of macho thing, right? We have both agree, we have a conflict here in a very direct way. I never give an inch, not at all. I might let the bear think it's outsmarted me and go around, right? I might do that if the bear seems like, okay, this is a really edgy bear and there are not many people in camp. I might let them think they're smart and go around, but I never let them win, because especially in general, it's a bad thing for bears, because bears like to win, like the rest of us. And if they feel, oh, I won on this guy, I'm gonna try that again, and they'll push it. You really can't let them win. The one time though, before I really got that in my head, I was in this squared off situation with Bead Nose's fall yearling cub. And I thought, I'm going to try to de-escalate this. And this little voice, which I don't get that much in my head, said, well, at least a worker's going to charge. Unfortunately, I had my bear spray out, because as soon as I started taking a step back, bam, came right at me. Unfortunately, I was able to, my reaction was quick, and I hit her. Unfortunately, it was Bead Nose, so she kind of looked in the distance like, oh, that was stupid, and didn't do anything. But so sometimes it can happen really close and really fast. The main thing is, yeah, you have to have it on you. You have to have it where you can reach it, and you really need to practice. It's not like somebody like a bear tech does, not like I do, but you need to be familiar with it. And especially you need to be familiar with popping the safety off of bear spray. It's because that's the one thing you don't want to go and point at the bear and then go,
Nothing happening.
oh, nothing happening.
Right.
Right. You don't want to work.
Can I add one thing
Oh, yeah.
there? And that is because I'm someone with fairly small hands. And for me, I can pop that safety off with my thumb. But what I practice is pulling it out of the holster and immediately getting the canister in this hand. I gotta get up where the camera can see me, so that I've got a firm grip on it, and then I can really get that thing off without risking dropping it, which of course is not what you want to do either. So, but I only know that because I've played with them, and I don't know how it is for the general public to, I assume, to get them, but they do make inert canisters that have no pepper in them. They just have the propellant. And so if you want to have something to practice with that you're sure is not going to, because you really don't want the stuff in your house.
Even a little bit.
Even a little bit. And so that is not going to spray pepper accidentally, and that will give you some sense of what the spray is like, although what comes out of the inert is not as voluminous as what comes out of the actual pepper cans. I'm not sure how, I mean, I know like we order it through work for the training that Carl does, but I don't know how. There must be some way to
you
get
can
them.
probably get it on Amazon or from, well, I know Counter Assault makes it. So have it on you and play with it, and play with weird situations, because weird situations will come up. You do have to practice. It's not like you have to practice far more with a firearm if you're going to use it. And that's one of the, besides the fact that we will all agree about, I'm sure, that we don't want to hurt a bear, you have to, a firearm, and I was an infantry rifleman for a lot of years. I shot competitively in high school. I shot competitively afterwards. I mean, I'm not a stranger to firearms, but you have to practice a lot. You still need to practice with bear spray, but not nearly as much. And that's one of the other great things about it, but you do need to practice. I could go on and on. So maybe I'm going to stop right now and then see if there are other questions about it.
I think I saw Judy's hand raised.
Yes, are all cans manipulated the same way, or is a different brand going to do something work differently?
Yeah, I've tried quite a bit, because we a range of bear sprays out there, and I have to be careful in what I say, because I'm kind of sort of representing the Park Service here. They are not all created equal. All the ones that I've used operate basically in the same way, because I don't think there are that many manufacturers of them out there. But nonetheless, they're not all created equal. I will just make a factual statement and leave it at this, although I would love to say a lot more. Yeah, they are not created equal. And the spray that we use at Brooks Camp and that I always use is counter assault.
Which is also what our office buys.
Yeah,
So.
leave it at that. But yeah.
Carl, changing the subject slightly, somebody emailed me before the meeting and asked about a blog, Carl, that you used to do.
Oh,
And she says she can't find it anymore.
yeah,
What's up with
I
that?
took it down because I just have so many conflicting interests, and it was I obsessively wanted to blog when I really needed to do. It was very sad. I was very fond of that blog, but no, I pulled it down.
Any chance you'll bring it back?
No, it's gone.
Okay.
I kind of wish I'd saved it, but I didn't.
I really wish you'd saved it. Sorry, I know you knew
Yeah,
that.
no, that was hard.
Lost to the ages of time. By the way, there's like already huge demand in the chat for repeat sessions with Carl and Susan. So, so thank you. We are not done yet, but just a reminder that if anybody does need to leave, you should feel free to leave. We don't judge. I want to go to a question that's in the chat that relates to something that came up before. We were talking about the prospect of moving camp, right? Moving the lodge to the other side of the river. And Rhonda asks, at this point, even if the camp was moved, wouldn't some bears, like moms with cubs, maybe, wouldn't some bears still seek out camp to avoid the male bears and such?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. They would seek, would they come over and seek? I think it's more the location of, I mean, the camp matters, having camp there matters, but I think that the places, well, let me back this up. We have a housing area at Brooks that's almost never seen by visitors. And bears come through there, but they don't come through that often. They're usually the bears that I see coming through there are just kind of cruising and looking for something to mess with, really, for the most part. And they don't stick around. And so that experience has led me to believe that that having camp there matters, and that having people there and some nice cut grass there matters. But at the end, and it probably puts a little more incentive than would be the case to be there, but they're not going to go really out of their way, because if they can go 300 yards up the beach, then they're really kind of scot-free. So it would be easier for them to take the route across where camp is now, I think, shoot up past where the campground is, go into the woods there, than it would be to go up to a more distant spot for camp. A lot would depend on where the campsite is, and that's why I'm not exactly clear where they want to put it over there.
Yeah.
So much depends. They're going to go out of their way somewhat to get a nice kind of human situation, but they're not going to. But they're real economizers with that kind of thing, unless they're really full and they're just kind of looking for trouble. In terms of their day-to-day business, they kind of think in terms of gain and loss.
Oh, I just thought a good counterexample that I think kind of reinforces that is McNeil River, which I know some of you may be familiar with that state area that is a really wonderful bear viewing area. It's discussed in Simpson's book as well. And I was lucky enough to be able to go there in connection with my work. And the contrast is the contrast between Brooks and McNeil is fascinating in many ways. But one having to do with this area is that the camp area at McNeil was very intelligently placed. It's not somewhere the bears would want to go otherwise. And they have to do very little hazing to keep the bears. They also have a camp there. The bears are not allowed in camp there either, But basically their hazing consists of, there's a picnic table in the middle of the area and they have a little saucepan that sits on the picnic table with rocks in it, and they pick it up and shake it. And that's it. Like that's their hazing, as compared to 4 people running around all day long actively with pepper spray and.
Well, we almost never spray bears.
I know, but
for
you
hazing.
do sometimes, not for hazing, and defense during hazing.
Right.
But basically what the folks who worked at McNeil said was that every year's sub-adults that have just been kicked out by mom will kind of test the boundaries a little bit, and they, use the rocks, make some noise, yell at them. They get the idea and they're done for the year. That basically, once the bears learn this is an area that they're not welcome and it will be a little unpleasant, that they don't bother. And so it's kind of that same thing of what's the incentive for them? If it's right there and it's appealing and I'm headed that way anyway, I'll stop and eat some grass and make the most of it. But if I've got to go way the heck over here, it's probably not worth it to me. So yeah, you want camp way the heck over here.
So Artie asks a question that I should have asked at the beginning. She wonders, how did each of you get involved? Susan, how did you get involved with the refuges? Carl, how did you get involved with Brooks Camp?
Oh, let's see, to not take up all the rest of our time. Well, I won't try to get into how I got to be a refuge manager. It was a rather long and convoluted path, but I've always had leanings in this direction, and actually got working for the Fish and Wildlife Service first, and then found out there was such a thing as a refuge manager and decided, I think I want to do that. And that took a little doing in about 10 years, but got there by way of getting a kind of a deputy manager position down in Arkansas. And so Carl and I, having both been in Alaska for a long time, like, oh, this is our big adventure, we'll go to Arkansas. And so we were there for a little less than 3 years. And towards the end of that time, I got a phone call because my time with Fish and Wildlife, I should say, before that was all up here. And I got a call from a woman I had known that I worked with in our regional office saying, hey, the manager position in King Salmon is coming open. I think it'd be great if you applied for it. And I went, I've been here a little over 2 years. It's not long enough. I've got all this going on. I really, and Carl was very smart and got online and just started pulling up web pages and showing me some pictures of what the Alaska Peninsula looks like, and pointing, pulled up the Katmai page, Brooks Camp, the refuge pages, photos, and I suddenly went, wow, maybe we do need to go there. So a lot of conversation later, I applied, I got the job, and we moved to King Salmon. And we've now been here almost 9 years.
And I'll kind of truncate mine too. Like say, I've always been a wildlife and just kind of a bio geek in general. And we came up here, and I was asked to do a little bit of an artist in residence, very, very informal artist in residence by Diane Chung, who's the superintendent of Katmai at the time. And I'd been out there the year before, and I thought, yeah, of course, great. And went out there, had a nice time doing that residency, and I kind of stayed on. Then I came back in the fall, so I must have spent like 6 weeks then, just kind of, and this is back in the old days when you could at the last moment say, oh, I think I'll go in September, and
Right.
block out 2 weeks, right, which is not a possibility anymore. So that was 2014. And 2015, I started volunteering for Interp, and in the interpretation, and I just wanted to, because I'd gotten to know the bears fairly well in 2014, bugged everybody with questions. And I just wanted to do Interp. Don't put me in the visitor center. It's kind of a naive way to approach it, but I was on the Falls platform every day, which I don't think anybody in Interp has done since, and I don't think anybody in Interp since would want to do. Did that 2015, came back, did it 2016. In 2016, I'd had enough of the crowding and all the kind of craziness that goes on, even though I now feel like a wimp to say it, because it was nothing back then compared to now. I mean, the last year was horrific. If any of you guys know Jasa, Ranger Jasa, ever sunny, unflappable Ranger Jasa, I saw her looking shell-shocked on multiple days last year. So it's gone far beyond that. But anyway, I was kind of like, I just is not what I want to deal with. But I you know, those 2 years, I think it's safe to say that I went up and down the Falls Trail more than anybody else in the world. and I noticed a lot of things about, or some things about bear movement on the trail and patterns that it took. And I wanted to talk to Michael Saxton about that, just to say, hey, you know, I've noticed these are some kind of problem points on the trail and such. And he said, and I told him kind of as an afterthought, yeah, well, unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to be back next year. And he said, well, would you like to join the bear management team? And I thought, okay, be cool. Yes, I would very much like to join the bear management team. Thank you. You know, and yeah, I saved the cartwheels for once I got outside. But so then, yeah, in 2017, I started off, and there's not a lot of training in bear management. You're kind of because you can't really train somebody for it. I mean, you can learn the location names and you can run some scenarios, but it's all Neanderthal back brain stuff for the most part. You just have to dive in. And so I dove in, and Tammy didn't kill me, and I survived. And even though I wouldn't have blamed Tammy if she had killed me a few times, and this is history.
Thank you. What other questions do people have?
Well, Stacy, actually, there were a couple of questions way back in the chat that I jotted myself a note.
Oh, good.
It comes back to the whole hunting question, which I know is not the most pleasant topic for a lot of folks, but obviously an area of concern, and an area of concern of mine. And the questions, well, there was, and I'm probably sort of mashing more than one question together because my note to myself is a little scant, but they were along the lines of, why is it called a refuge if there's hunting, which is a very common question within the National Wildlife Refuge system. And then about the future of the refuge, and could it ever be all bear viewing and not hunting? And so if there aren't other, you know, I don't want to derail us on the topic. So before I launch into that, are there other, you know, do you want to keep going in the kind of what's your preference, Stacy?
I think that sounds like a great question. And if others have questions, just raise your hand in real life or in Zoom. But Susan, if you wanted to tackle that, that would be great.
Sure. I mean, they're both very good questions. They're both tough questions. And as far as why it's a refuge if there's hunting is, it's one of those words that means different things to different people. Clearly, Congress thought that it's something where it would be appropriate to hunt, and that's who gives us our marching orders. But one thing that refuges do that is critical, and that a lot of these animals would not survive at all without, is that we provide habitat, and hopefully high quality habitat. And the other big piece is what Carl pointed out earlier when I was talking about that whole elaborate system that we have in place for competitive guiding, is that gives us a lot of control over how this is done. It's going on year 3 now of appeals, and maybe going to still end up in court. But 3 years ago, we had basically these guys get, and I say they're almost all men, but these guides, put it that way, get, when they win a competition, they get a 5-year permit. And then at the end of that 5 years, they can renew non-competitively for another 5 years if they have followed the terms of their permit. And 3 years ago, I denied one of those for a guide who has operated out here for a very, very long time. Like I said, we're still working through appeals and whatnot on that, but I have that ability. I can say, you're done. You have had too many violations. You are not following your operating plan. You're out. Whereas that's much, much harder to do on state land. And so we do offer more protection in that sense than just kind of a Wild West show. But yes, I realize that to a lot of people, the word refuge is incompatible with the idea of these animals being hunted, and I respect that opinion.
And you want?
No, I am going to address the second
No,
question.
go for
And in talking about the second one, kind of the future of the refuge, obviously something I think about a lot. That's my job. This is another one of those areas where, speaking as an employee of the Fish and Wildlife Service, I am speaking as an employee of the Fish and Wildlife Service and not as Susan Alexander, private individual. So those answers might be slightly different, but I like the idea of bear viewing on the refuge. I like the idea of people being able to have an incredible wilderness experience with bears, which I think is more what we're likely to see and what we are starting to see emerging. I mean, I talked about the fact that there are day trips now, but there are some people who are interested, and I think it will start to happen that we will get more of a wilderness experience where you go out and camp on a beach on the Pacific coast for a few days and see bears, or you go out and float a river and see bears. Because there are enough bears that if you do a 4-day float, you're going to see a bear at some point. And I want people to be able to have that experience on the refuge. I think that would be, I would love to have that. So this conflict is going to have to be resolved somehow. One thing that I'm probably going to retire in a couple of years, and one of the things I am determined will happen before I leave, is that we will get some meaningful visitor monitoring going. Right now, the only hard data we have on visitation is what we get from the guides, where they report their client use stays. And they have a very strong incentive to underreport because we charge them a piddly little amount, but we charge them per day. And also, you know, fishing guides are not the most into paperwork of all people. And if they don't happen to write, you know, that we know the numbers are not super accurate. We need to be doing a better job of monitoring. Now we're talking about an area the size of Connecticut, and we have a staff right now of 8 people. So, you know, and one of those is our maintenance guy, and one of them is the pilot, and what, you know, so we don't have a ton of resources to bring to it. So we need, it's actually, I am trying right now to get some professional help to help us develop a plan for how we can best use our limited resources to do this. That will enable us to address some of these concerns much more effectively. So the one thing that I will say about the climate in which all of this exists is, and this is another thing Simpson talks about in this wonderful book, is the intensive management statute that was passed by the state in the 90s requires, in some instances, that the state, in certain circumstances, having to do with prey populations like moose and caribou, the state is required to do predator control to try to increase those populations. Predators, of course, primarily in this case being bears and wolves. And this has been a huge conflict between the state and the federal government for a long time, because we will not allow the state to do predator control on federal land. You can imagine how politically charged all that has become. Part of what helps us keep that line in the sand is that there's a huge constituency of people who have an economic interest, especially in our bears. And so in the current scenario, the fact that these bears are hunted actually helps protect them from predator control, which in my view would, you know, I don't think that's debatable. It would be, as far as individual bears go, as far as the population goes, far more impactful. So
designedly more impactful.
Right, that's the idea, is we're going to go out there and reduce the population. You know, hunting, we're going to go out and take a few carefully selected individuals. Predator control, we're going to go out there and reduce the population down to the point where we get more moose and caribou coming out of the deal. So if I snapped my fingers today and made hunting go away on the refuge, in a way, I might be bringing something more impactful to that population of bears. So it's complicated. And also how to make that transition is complicated, given for all the good things for this competitive system, it means that every one of those guide use areas has somebody whose business model is structured around using that piece of ground. So where do you put the bear viewing? And I did have someone suggest once, and I think it might be how this could happen, is that at some point, at a good transition point, there might even be, you might be able to kind of take one of those units out of circulation without, but when these folks retire, they can ask to have their permit transferred in connection with the sale of their business. So it's not quite as simple, it's complicated. But anyway, you wanted to add
I
something, I
have
think.
one thought about that. You can't really, it's hard to see in Alaska, but I think the question of, since hunting goes on in wildlife refuges, not all of them, but probably the majority of
a
them
lot of
all
them.
across the country, it's easier to see outside here. This is not good land for agriculture. It's not good land for timber raising. But if you looked at Felsenthal National Wildlife Refuge that Susan managed before we came here, it is surrounded by, and some of you may have been, and I know one of you I'm sure has been in the South and seen commercial timber growing in the southern United States. It's the largest sustainable, more or less, timber harvesting area in the world. And you can tell exactly where the line is for the refuge. Even if there's a pretty mature timber crop right outside of it, even if it hasn't been clear cut or anything, and it's a pretty old crop, you can tell instantly, because the timber farms, and it's a business, so they kind of have to do it this way. The trees are packed on there as tightly as they can possibly get. There's very little light coming in, very little in the understory. You come onto the refuge, you have these huge pines that have lots of space, lots of understory, and those refuges are hunted. And I mean, they're hunted sustainably, but they're hunted hard. But if you know anything, if you've ever walked in one of these commercial forests when they're mature, there's nothing. I mean, there's some things in there, but effectively compared to the incredibly rich habitat. And here we're talking about all kinds of species, box turtles, red-cockaded woodpeckers, all kinds of species that have nothing to do with hunting. They also get that territory and in that habitat, and they are surrounded, in that case, by timberland, elsewhere by agricultural interests or shopping malls or what have you, that is effectively, marginal at absolute best. And so that's, it's, I think I mentioned it before, and I apologize if I had, but I mean, I think once you get to kind of back it up and say, Susan and I are both very much ecotopians at heart. I mean, we are very, very idealistic in what we see on the horizon and would like to see. But, when you want to take practical action, I think in anything, and certainly in conservation, when it's time to get in the actual game of doing on the ground conservation, you play the hand you're dealt. You don't play the hand you want. You don't play the hand you would think you ought to have. You play the hand you're dealt. And, in the world of trade-offs and everything, I think that even if, the mandates of refuges and parks for that matter, with all the enormous use that parks are getting, that's not really great for wildlife either. It's certainly not great for Brooks Camp to have as many people as going there right now. But we do the best we can with what we're given.
I feel like you've hit, and I'll get to you in 1 minute, but I think you both beautifully made a point that is also well made in both of our books. When we read Mike's book, an idea that we kept coming back to with every chapter was kind of who gets to draw the line, right? Where does the line get drawn? Who gets to draw it? And how can we influence those decisions? And then, Carl, the other thing that you kept saying is that it's complicated. And I feel like both Mike's book and Sherry's book really challenge us to consider the complications in a really thoughtful way. So the examples that you just gave really illustrate those kind of big ideas really beautifully. So thank you for that. Grazer Girl, whose name I can't remember in real life, but I'm going with I'm going with your avatar name. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Actually, I think you just addressed my question. My question was going to be, what can we do to support you? But I hear that it's so complicated that there's not an easy question.
Well, yeah, no, it's not easy. I mean, I'd say don't give up on your ideals. I mean, I think that's the moral battle in all of life, really, is to keep your ideals, but be willing to get messy when you're trying to put them into actual practice.
Are there any particular organizations that you see as something that's
You answered that.
particularly heading in the right direction, or gives the kind of support that you find the most productive?
Remember that the recording is running.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, we're not allowed to talk about that.
No, I mean, we're definitely allowed to talk about everything. I just want to remind our government officials that this is semi on the
Nobody
record.
cares. I'm a
take it off.
I'm a bear chasing Neanderthal.
that
Nobody cares
question.
what I
Sorry, I
do.
didn't think
This
about
job is
putting you on
more
the spot.
politically sensitive, but I have to be careful about
Yeah,
the
yeah.
situation. I keep looking for like a bear, something bear specific. I've yet, I think Be Bear Aware. I don't agree with everything that Be Bear Aware puts out, but they seem to me to be a good organization. There are some others that claim some things that I've looked into and I haven't really been able, and I've written them about, and they never written me back. But from what I've seen, Be Bear Aware is out there doing a lot of good work. This is on the research end and it's very low profile, but I tend to go for low profile organizations. I'm not going to say that all the big conservation names I don't like, but I frankly don't like, or I'm not that blown away by most of them. I think the smaller groups tend to be better, but it's not as, they're really kind of limited in what they do, of course. But the IBA, the International Association for Bear Management, and
it's their acronym and their name are
not
like don't jive very well, but it's I'll look it up real quick.
But
they're basically a professional organization of people who work with bears, primarily biologists and bear researchers. And there's a ton of good work going on out there in relation to both just understanding the biology and the ecology of bears, but also bear-human interaction and how to coming up with better solutions.
Right.
Is it the International Association for Bear Research and Management?
Thank you.
That would be it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll post the link.
IBA and that don't quite.
Right. It always
jive,
confuses me, but
yeah.
I like them. They also do annual conferences, which are a great way for people in the bear world to get together, trade ideas, trade things that have been giving good results. It's not very glamorous, but if we're talking about things that are bear specific, and I do like on the whole, I like what I've seen from Be Bear Aware too.
And the thing that I wanted to add, which is not specific to organizations, but just that I applaud you all for the fact that you are reading these books and interested in these things. I mean, those are two excellent books, and you gaining that kind of understanding and appreciation of some of the complexities is tremendous. When political issues come up, and I haven't been through as much of this as a lot of people who work for the government, but times when we have public comment periods, what's so frustrating is that most of the comments we get don't really address what it is that's being proposed. And some organizations are better about this than others, but there are organizations out there who will kind of selectively emphasize certain parts, or the story that you get is not if someone is really, sorry, this is hard because there is a lot of good that is done by nonprofits who bring some of these issues to people's attention, but they frequently do it in such a way that oversimplifies the situation. So, folks like you who have taken the time to understand some of these broader issues, you might hear about nonprofit X saying, oh, there's a big deal public comment period going on about this new regulation. Here's a pre-written letter that you can sign and send in. And you're now in a position, as you're educating yourselves and reading about all these things, to not necessarily sign their pre-written letter, but to maybe understand the issue a little bit more and to actually offer, because agencies actually do pay attention to public comments, especially substantive ones that have, that actually address something first that we are really proposing, and second say, well, this is a bad idea, and here's why I think it's a bad idea. It's not just a matter of voting by, sheer numbers do have an impact, but 60,000 of word for word the same comment does not have nearly the impact of one thoughtfully written letter.
60,000 one, are you sure?
Maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but there's a principle there. So bravo to you for digging into this. I think that is something that does help. And the one other thing I will add that is not lobbying, I'm not allowed to lobby for funding, but the other thing that hamstrings federal agencies, the Fish and Wildlife Service more than the Park Service, our better known brethren in Interior definitely do better in the budget department. But I mean, you heard me bemoaning my lack of staff. On a practical day-to-day basis, that's the thing that hamstrings me the most in trying to do an effective job of managing the refuge. So just on a practical level, and I realize you can't, I don't expect you all to ride off to Washington and say, give them more money. But just on a practical level, that's the thing that makes my job the hardest, is just that I don't have enough people.
And again, a theme that came up loud and clear, especially in Mike's book, right, about the challenges of management at Brooks Camp. It is 6 o'clock, so I am going to start kind of wrapping this up. If anybody needs to leave, you should definitely feel free. We are not going to go much longer because I'm going to hit the limit on my Zoom cloud recording. I see one question in the chat that I want to raise, and then Elizabeth will get to you. If anybody else has other questions, raise your hand. So Elizabeth, let's do your question first, and then Rhonda, I'll get to your question in the chat. And if anybody else has a final question, please raise your hand. Elizabeth, go ahead.
So I was focused on this issue of complexity, and reading Sherry Simpson's book, you can see it over and over and over again. And I think the biggest one is encapsulated in her term that I'm trying to understand, because I thought I understood it like a month or two ago. And then I realized when I read it recently, she used it in relationship to the hunter, and it's the metaphysical bear. And what I finally think I understood is that each of us has a different idea of what the bear actually is. And that's because of our own internal understanding or metaphysical concept about, or a metaphorical concept about what this bear is. And I think that's part of what brings about the complications, even into the public sector, and all these value-based arguments that make them so intense. Anyway,
Wow.
so I mean, that's a long discussion that you could really get to all the different aspects of this metaphorical bear. But I think that would be interesting. I wish we had time to look at that more closely. I mean, even in relation to the last couple of chapters that we were reading, the fearsome bear and the hunted bear. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point.
Well said.
I would say, though, we've been emphasizing complexity a lot, but Susan, I sometimes tend to go on the dark side, as I'm afraid Stacy found out in our last phone call, which but because one thing that isn't covered, it's quite a bit more brutal out here, actually, and a lot of what goes on with bears is a lot more brutal than shows up in that book or ever makes the media, I'm afraid. And I'm not going to go into it right now, but I will say that there's some things that are just right. A lot of it is complex, but unfortunately, there's an element of it that, I think, for any moral and reflective person, is just bad. So, you know, it is very, very good to think about the complexity, but there are definitely some, we should always remind that there are some
Kind of some bright lines
yeah,
there.
some
Yeah.
bright lines too, which is
Yeah.
not in distinct, not to contradict what you're saying at all, but just to just put one of my pet qualifications on there.
I think to me, the most interesting big question that I keep coming back to with her book is the question that Elizabeth just raised. You know, what are the ideas that we have about bears in our heads? And how does that affect, for better or worse, the way that people interact with bears in real life?
Yeah.
And yeah. Susan, there are a couple of questions in chat about funding for the refuges. There's a question, can you all use federal grant money to support your work? And is there an organization like the Katmai Conservancy, which provides support for Brooks Camp? Is there anything like that for the refuges?
Those are great questions. And generally speaking, federal grant money goes to non-federal recipients. Sometimes, and this is something that I'm also trying to do more of at the refuge, sometimes we can work with non-federal partners in a way where they have access to grant funds, federal or private or state, that we don't. And we have a common goal. And we're actually in some discussions right now. They're really exciting on the visitor front with Katmai and with the local borough government and the local chamber of commerce to try to improve some of the visitor infrastructure in King Salmon. And we're very much hoping that that partnership can tap into grant money. So not directly, but yes, sometimes indirectly. And there is a Friends of Alaska National Wildlife Refuges group, which is kind of the refuge counterpart of the Katmai Conservancy. And the only reason I didn't mention them is that we haven't worked with them a ton with our refuge, but they do really good work. And their goal, they're still a very small organization. And as you can imagine, trying to be a friends group to 16 national wildlife refuges in Alaska is a tall order. And so I think they are a very worthy organization, and they do have a special relationship with Alaska Refuges, the way Katmai Conservancy does with the park. So
And they're part of the national.
And they are under the national umbrella of the National Wildlife Refuge Association, which is kind of a friends group to the refuge system as a whole. So those are two very worthwhile organizations that do good work. Neither of them works right now that directly with our refuges, but they are, they're good folks and they do good things.
Do you have volunteers at the refuges and or alliances with Indigenous groups?
We definitely have volunteers at the refuges. One thing that's a little frustrating right now is that in order to bring in in order to bring in volunteers, you need staff to recruit them, select them, orient them, give them things to do, support them. And so we're limited in how many volunteers we can use because our staff is so small right now. It's gotten substantially smaller over the last few years. That said, right now, I believe we have a volunteer opening out on volunteer.gov, which is where all ours and all other refuges, and I think government-wide, certainly park volunteer opportunities, yeah, are posted there. So we have one right now for someone to assist in our visitor program for the summer that is open. That's the only volunteer position.
There you go, guys.
But yeah, would love to have one of you guys put in for that. So that's open. Can't remember the closing date, but it's got a little while to run yet, and it is on volunteer.gov, and you can search those geographically. And I'm trying to remember the exact language in the question. It doesn't really describe our relationships. We have, I would say we have relationships with all of the Indigenous groups in and near the refuge. There are, as you all may know, there are lots of federally recognized tribal governments in Alaska, over 200 of them. And every village in and near the refuge has an established tribal government with a village council. And Those villages generally tend to be about 100 people. They're very small. Some are within the refuge boundaries, some are outside. And this is another one of those topics that we could talk about at length, but under the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, they all have kind of a bubble of land owned by a village corporation that is around the village, even though it's inside the refuge. But we obviously have a lot of interests in common and a great need to communicate and be in touch. That has been hampered a good bit by COVID, because normally I would be going around visiting villages this time of year, and our visitor services folks would be going to the villages to do school presentations a couple of times during the school year. And so everything, you know, like we're all remote now, but I'm hoping that maybe we'll be moving into a phase where I can get back out and do some village visits, because especially in that environment, it's true for all of us, but really with villages, you just need to go. You need to be there. And so that's, yes, there are those relationships and they're very important. And I hope we're going to get back to where we can do more of me, and our law enforcement officer needs to get to the villages and just meet people, have them have a chance to ask him questions, so that the first time he meets folks is not when he's checking their hunting license. So I hope we can get back to doing more of that visiting.
Thank you. So there is much more to discuss, but we are not going to be able to discuss it tonight. Again, just kind of a constant refrain in the chat for, you know, have Carl and Susan here every week. So I'll be in touch. I know you don't have bandwidth, but I will be in touch. Seriously, thank you. A profound thank you to Carl and Susan for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Yes.
It was wonderful. Genuinely very perceptive questions.
Oh,
it was
yes.
a lot of fun.
No,
Yeah, thank you all for your excellent questions. Thank you to Carl and Susan for helping us engage with Sherry Simpson's In Dominion of Bears, and also for helping us go beyond In Dominion of Bears. So thank you, everybody. We'll meet again in 2 weeks. I'll post the information in chat and email. I think our next chapter is The Hunted Bear. Start reading now. And Carl and Susan, thank you so much. You've given us lots and lots to think about in the best possible way.
It was a pleasure.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Stacy?
Thank